We're going to head straight into our next session with Tom Preston-Werner, who I believe we've got on the line currently. Tom is speaking to us today from San Francisco. He's currently a co-founder at CodeStarter, an organization that puts laptops in the hands of young people from all walks of life so that they have a better chance at a future in tech. Previously, Tom was co-founder and CTO, then CEO, then president of GitHub. And we're really excited to have Tom with us today because he is the original Jekyll creator. You might have seen on the contribution graph that Ben just had up, almost all of those initial contributions are Tom's. He is the beginning of Jekyll. And with the talk title that we have from Tom today, it would seem that although his recent contributions to Jekyll have slowed down, he hasn't stopped thinking about static sites any less. So with that, I'd like to turn over to Tom.
All right, great. Well, thank you for the awesome introduction. So yeah, today I'm going to talk a little bit about some ideas I have for Jekyll. But first, I'd like to say a huge thanks to Cloud Cannon for putting on this awesome conference. You know, when I first created Jekyll, I never dreamed that there would be a Jekyll conference. This is a little bit weird for me and kind of awesome. And so thank you for having me on here. This is quite the pleasure. And really a huge thanks to all the contributors because, you know, like you said, I haven't contributed to Jekyll for a little while, several years probably. And so, but you know, it keeps going. This is the beauty of open source. You can create something and the community picks it up and makes it even better. So first of all, thank you to everyone out there who's contributed to Jekyll so far. It's amazing to see it keep going. Ben Balter, who just talked, you know, he works endlessly on the back end of GitHub Pages with other people at GitHub, and that's huge. I think a big part of why Jekyll is where it is now is because of GitHub Pages, and yeah, it's not easy to create infrastructure to run all of that. And now to other companies, right? Other companies that are picking up Jekyll as a part of their infrastructure and making it easier for people to host their own Jekyll sites. So thank you to everyone there. I wanted to call out, you know, Brian was talking in the first talk about how he uses the documentation as sort of one of the big signs of the health of a static site generator, and just the site design in general. And you know, the Jekyll site, it looks amazing. And it looks that way because of a guy named Kobe Chappell, who is also at GitHub, who did the design for the current Jekyll site, and it's just amazing. So sometimes you don't really think about who puts together the things that make our repositories, our projects, so great. So I just wanted to thank him. And then I'll finish up my thank yous here very quickly. But a huge thanks to Parker Moore, who's also going to talk later today. Literally, Jekyll would probably no longer exist if Parker hadn't come on as the primary maintainer and picked it up where I left off. It was languishing. You know, Jekyll hadn't had any changes in, you know, a year or two, and he really revitalized it and brought the community that exists today. He's primarily responsible for bringing on board. So Parker, thank you so much. You're amazing. So Jekyll, you know, we're all here to talk about Jekyll. It's interesting to think about the history of static sites. You know, some others have talked about them a little bit. I'm going to share my screen here real quick. But if you look at this, and I was wondering, like, how early was Jekyll? Because there's so many static sites now. There's gajillions of static site generators. Where did Jekyll fall in the history of them? And so if you go on staticsitegenerators.net, you can go and you can see there's a bunch that aren't listed when they were created, so I don't know. But if you start where there's history, you start with Blossom, and you've got some other ones, and then you come to Nanoc. I think it's pronounced Nanoc. Maybe it's Nano-C. I don't actually know. But what's interesting about this one is that this is what inspired me in the creation of Jekyll. I tried to use Nanoc, and I found it a bit awkward and weird, and so, you know, I'm prone to building my own software. So I started working on Jekyll, and you can see Jekyll right down here, right? So all of these are about 7 years ago. Nanoc precedes them by a little bit. But really, in the history of gajillions of static site generators, right, Jekyll is at the very, very top, one of the very first. And that's really interesting. It's really interesting to see some of these, and especially Jekyll, that have survived for so long. Right? It's hard for an open source project to survive this long. And again, that's because of the community that makes that possible. but just a little bit of context there. You also note, this is such a cool site, right? So you can also update by, or you can see this list by when they were updated. Whoops. You can see the list by when they were updated, and if you sort them that way, then you'll also, oops, that's backwards. Then you'll also see that Jekyll comes in at 5 hours ago. So not only is Jekyll one of the oldest static site generators that there is, it is also one of the most frequently updated. So let's keep that going. This is because of you, the community, the people that are watching right now. And it's people like you that are going to keep it this way. So if you're out there and you love open source and you've been using Jekyll, maybe you're thinking about contributing, I'd say a great way to contribute, always an amazing way to contribute, is through documentation. So let me switch back here so I can see you. Okay. So an amazing way to contribute is always through documentation. So if you've been thinking of contributing, go look at the documentation. Again, like Brian was saying, if the documentation for a project is bad, then people are likely to go searching for something that's better. So again, you all have different things that you're doing with Jekyll. You all have different problems that you come up against, and you all find the documentation lacking at some point. When that happens, exactly at that point that happens is the best time to go into the documentation. It's all open source, of course. Go find it, augment it to clarify the problem that you are having, and then submit that as a pull request. And through these small iterations, the documentation for Jekyll, I think, can be totally world-class and make it easier for everyone in the world to use Jekyll and get started with Jekyll in the future, allowing the community and the user base to continue growing. So keep that in mind. So again, just to talk about where Jekyll came from, because it's important when we think about where Jekyll's going and some of the ideas that we could put into play, it's important to know why Jekyll exists, or what the philosophy of Jekyll is. So I'll talk a little bit about where the philosophy that I had when I first started working on it, and how that's changed over time a little bit. So in the beginning, Jekyll was created because I was tired of losing content. You know, I'd had blogs on WordPress, and I can't even remember the names of the blogs that I used like 10 years ago, but you know, I'd go from one to the other, and I'd go through, you know, servers, and then I'd shut servers down, and I'd, you know, upgrade my computer, and there weren't things like Dropbox or Backblaze or good backup services, and I'd have external hard drives, and God knows what. Anyway, all of that content is now gone. I had a website at mojambo.com. I rebuilt a Jeep, and I had a whole blog that I created around rebuilding this Jeep at jeepsarebuiltnotbought.com. I had, when I got into Ruby, I had a website called rubyisawesome.com, and I had all kinds of tips and, you know, explanations of cool Ruby things. Anyway, that's gone. All of this stuff, all this cool content that I generated in the past is now just disappeared forever. And that made me really frustrated and sad. And you know, this is about the time when I was doing GitHub, and I said, what if I could never lose my content again? How would I do that? And one of the best ways to do that, I think, is to put it on GitHub. Put it in a Git repository, put it up on a hosting site somewhere, and now you're going to be damn sure that you're never going to lose that content again. So I wanted to do that. Okay, well, how can I create a blog around that, right? And I'm also tired of maintaining like WordPress. You know, nobody wants to go in and apply patches to WordPress like every month. This is just the nature of software. Nothing against WordPress. WordPress is amazing. This is the nature of like all dynamic software. If you don't patch it constantly, then you're going to be you're just sitting there ripe for attackers to come in and exploit it in some way, and now you've got spam on your site, and they're probably relaying mail spam through it, God knows what, right? So you can solve all these problems through a static site generator, right? This is where I started looking at static site generators, of which there were very few at the time. Nanoc was awesome, but I wanted one that was specifically blog aware. I wanted to be able to create a file in Textile at the time, right? You know, nobody uses Textile anymore, but GitHub was all Textile in the early days. This was kind of what we had chosen. And so I wanted something where I could write a Textile file and put it in a Git repository, and then through some sort of deploy script or something, make it go online really easily with some sort of hosting. You know, at the time there was no GitHub Pages, obviously. Jekyll precedes GitHub Pages. And so it would just be, you know, push it somewhere, or I don't know, get it somewhere online, right? Just static pages, that's easy to do. You can do that lots of places. And so I sat down and I wrote the original version of Jekyll, and it did that, right? So Jekyll has always been and always had first-class blogging capabilities built in. That was kind of the whole reason that Jekyll exists, separate from other static site generators at the time. And so the philosophy is really that, like, make it easy to add content, right? Super easy. Make it so you're never going to lose your content. Make it so that you don't have to constantly apply security updates and maintain dynamic software. And make it really easy to deploy, but also let the user make it customizable, right? So plugins. So plugins were available very early on in Jekyll by just, like Ben said, having just a Ruby file. It would just go in there. Now you can call it using Liquid, etc. So that's always been in there. So those are kind of the main things that I wanted in Jekyll, in that static site generator. And really, at the end of the day, the whole thing, the whole project is about getting your content online easily and then not having to worry about it afterwards. Okay? So that's where Jekyll began. And so thinking about this, Jekyll still is that, right? It still fits that need pretty much exactly. Now it's expanded in its capabilities. You can use it for all kinds of sites. It's great for data now. It has collections. It's sort of simplifying the model of how Jekyll comes together to make it easier to understand, more flexible. But fundamentally, at its core, it's still pretty much the same. And so where do we want to go from there? Where can we go from there? What kinds of ideas can we apply in the future to make it even better, even simpler, and even more what I had originally thought it could be? Okay. So let's think about that. Jekyll's pretty easy to use. If you're a Ruby developer, it's pretty simple. You understand gems and installing things via Ruby, gems, etc. Like, that's not too bad. Then you have to, you have to learn it and you have to write it, and then you have to get it somewhere. GitHub Pages makes that super easy, but it's still not the easiest thing there could be, right? There's still friction involved in creating and deploying Jekyll sites, especially around plugins, I think, right? Plugins have sort of been this difficult to deal with thing, especially from a Jekyll hosting perspective. So GitHub Pages, we always just rejected any custom plugins because we didn't want to run people's custom code, and sandboxing and things back then when we built it were pretty, they weren't great, and we didn't want to spend a lot of time like fixing our build servers that people had just put malicious code in there. So Ben was talking about GitHub Pages now has a Dockerized sort of sandbox that things run in. It's possible that in the future GitHub Pages can support arbitrary plugins by just saying, okay, well, you know what, don't worry about it. We're going to throw this away anyway. So as long as your site builds within some reasonable amount of time, like, we're happy to spin up the CPUs to do it, and then you can have your custom plugins, right? So there's one thing, and that's not really a crazy idea. I think that's probably just a simple evolution of GitHub Pages. We'd have to ask Ben what he thinks about that idea, but it certainly seems possible to me. Places like Heroku or CodePen, there's like a million places online where you can run code now. This is becoming a very common thing. People aren't so concerned about arbitrary code execution. You can lock servers down very easily and create really clean build environments from scratch using Docker. So that's becoming much easier, right? But even then, like, that's great, but it still means that you have to make sure that those plugins are working correctly on your local environment, right? So you have to make sure that you have the right build headers available if you're going to compile C extensions or do whatever you want. And of course, you have to know Ruby. So let's say you're a JavaScript developer, you're a Go developer, or you're a Python developer, whatever. Maybe Jekyll's not going to be an awesome choice for you because this is not your primary language. Jekyll wants plugins to be written in Ruby, obviously. So that's another limitation, right? So let's think about that limitation and wonder what would happen if you could write your plugins in any language, one, and you didn't even have to run them on your own computer, right? Now this could eliminate the problem for things like GitHub Pages or other static site servers like Cloud Cannon, for instance, right? If you could run a plugin anywhere, the cloud, right? And you could write your plugins in any language, well, what would the interface be? Well, you'd have to have something like, I don't know, a JSON API, but that's certainly possible. We all understand JSON APIs, right? So now you could use something like Amazon Lambda. If you've heard of Amazon Lambda, it's this really cool service that Amazon came out with not that long ago, maybe 3, 4, or 5 months ago, that allows you to create a little node program, like a self-contained little Node.js program, and then you upload that to Amazon, and it becomes this executable thing in their environment. And they handle all of the execution for it. You just call it, it runs, it does its thing, and then boom, it's gone. And you can call it as many times as you want, and it'll scale as much as you want, right? Every instance runs stateless. It can spin up as many of them as it wants, and you're done, right? So you could imagine using some kind of service like that to create a Jekyll plugin that simply responds to requests from your local Jekyll thing, and it says, hey, here's my content. I want you to apply this plugin to it. I'll send you over the content via JSON API. You crunch on it, and then you send me back the response, which generally is just going to be text anyway, or maybe data structures. Jekyll can now reincorporate that back into your local service. So now you don't ever have to worry about running or locally installing plugins. Okay? This becomes really, really useful for especially eliminating the differences between your local environment and something like GitHub Pages. Right? Now you don't have to worry about executing arbitrary code. Someone else is going to do it for you. Okay? Well, that's maybe a difficult point, is that now you have a third-party reliance on someone who's going to run some code. But there are ways that these things can be whatever. So you have some maybe it's actually an open source service that's sponsored by some company that says, hey, you know what? Here's this repository of plugins. There's 10,000 Jekyll plugins, and we're going to make them all available to you via this API, and anyone can upload new ones, and they're all going to run in Amazon Lambda. And then boom, you can just call on those whenever you want, and also GitHub Pages, or anyone could rely on those, right? The downsides being, if they're not available, if that service isn't running, then you can't build your site, right? But the ability to then spin those up, or there's other services where you can run snippets of code, right? Like, I mean, even CodePen, you can run arbitrary code on there. You could write a thing that would do it pretty simply over there. Maybe not CodePen, but something similar, right? So the idea is to eliminate the differences between a local and a hosted environment by pushing the code execution somewhere else entirely. Okay, that's a little bit crazy, right? Like added complexity. Interesting. Okay. Cool, but maybe too crazy, right? Okay. Well, let's instead of getting less crazy, let's actually get more crazy and try to solve that problem by getting more crazy, right? So the more crazy thing to do then is to say, well, if we're executing all of our plugins externally, well, why don't we also just run Jekyll externally, right? Like, why are we even running Jekyll on our local computers? Is it really necessary? In today's universe, where everything that we're doing is already online, all the code for all the things that we're doing is mostly on servers, and then our computers are just dumb clients that receive essentially drawing commands to show it to us. Okay? So let's say you compose your content locally, because I, for one, personally, I want to write my own content in my own local text editor. I'm sorry, I'm not going to write it on some random service. Okay, so yes, I'm a hypocrite. That's the way it is. I want my content local, but when I'm executing things, okay, someone else can do that for me. Because really, I don't care where the code is running that's going to transform my Jekyll files. All I want to do, and what I primarily want to do, is make sure that it happens, and that when it goes up to the static site host, that it's the same. That it's the same locally and remotely. That's what I care about more than running it locally myself. Okay. So you could consider running Jekyll remotely, and GitHub Pages already does this. Cloud Cannon already does this. Similar services already do this, but they don't do it for me always, right? They still expect me to author locally, run Jekyll locally in my development phase, and then push it over somewhere else where maybe their stack's different. What if they're using a slightly different version of Jekyll? What if they're using, a different version of some plugin that I'm also using that they've built in to make available? Or, maybe I can't do it at all because they don't support arbitrary plugins, right? These are all huge limitations. So maybe we want Jekyll to also be executed remotely. And this also solves a problem, on the Jekyll talk list. Parker was asking, what do you all think the priorities should be for Jekyll 3.0? And one of the top ones, and we've got a lot of talk about it, is should there be a single-click installer for Jekyll? It's like, okay, well, we all like installing things in a single click, and that would be cool. But really, is that the way we want to solve the problem? Maybe we could have a zero-click installer. Okay, well, maybe not, because you got to get the content somewhere somehow. But you can start to think about how other people have solved this, and actually people do this. You could actually do this entire thing the way it is right now, minus arbitrary plugins, using Dropbox, for instance. Right? With GitHub, you're going to have to commit and push, and then it'll go to GitHub Pages or somewhere else that's going to pick it up. But generally, once you push, then boom, that's public. So really, you kind of want a space where you can develop in a sandbox for yourself, right, your draft versions, and then you want to be able to make that public. And right now, with all the hosts that I've seen, basically you push it, you either save it to Dropbox, you push it to GitHub, you upload a file, whatever, and then it's public, right? But for me, I want to develop locally and see it, and then push it, right? That's what I do now. But I wouldn't have to do that. If I can get my content over to you early and have that in some sandboxed place. Let's say maybe I'm on a branch, right? Maybe I'm on my local Jekyll branch, and I push that over to GitHub, and then someone picks that up. That would be one way to do it. On Dropbox, you're probably going to have to create a copy of the directory, and then copy that over, and like that's I don't like that, right? That's more complexity. But what if there was, instead of running Jekyll locally, what if instead there was a small client, it would only have to be a very small number of lines of code, but if there was a client locally that every time I saved a file, it made a commit for me in my repository, and it pushed that to a branch on GitHub, that then my service, whatever's hosting my static files, looked at and listened for and gave me a preview.myweblog.com that I could then look at. So now I'm making changes, I'm saving, I'm actually committing to a repository in a branch, and those are immediately being picked up by the service, run in Jekyll, whatever version of Jekyll they're going to use to publish anyway, and now I'm seeing that. So I want to see my changes. Okay, save my file, go over to the website, and click reload, right? So what if I can do that? Now I don't have to run Jekyll locally at all, which really I don't care about doing anyway, because when I push it somewhere, it's going to get processed anyhow, unless I'm generating all the files locally and pushing those files. But I don't want to do that, right? That's just extra hassle. I want the transformation to all come in one process. Okay, so let someone else run the code, let them run Jekyll, let them run plugins. Okay, this is one idea for making Jekyll also more approachable, because if you can go to someone and say, hey, you can use Jekyll, you don't actually have to install anything except maybe this 50-line file that just sits there and listens for saved files and makes a commit on a specific branch of your Git repository and then pushes it to GitHub. And that's it, right? And then when you want that to be the real deal, then you just merge in that branch. Maybe there's a command you run and it squashes and merges it, whatever, right? So don't run it locally. Let someone else do it, all right? So there's one idea, all right? That's one collection of ideas, something that could happen. There's another interesting, totally separate issue, right? Another interesting set of ideas, really around the content that you're putting into your blog. So one of the coolest things that I've seen recently is GitHub Pages now makes the data, the list of repositories that you have on your account are now always available to your Jekyll site in the site object, right? So you can use it from within Liquid, you can generate pages from it, or you can embed stuff on a page from it. Instead of having to use JavaScript to dynamically pull that in after the web page loads, like people do, or like people used to do, now you can have the content available to you at page generate time. So you're generating these static pages kind of the way that we want, right? Like running JavaScript after the fact to pull in external data, and that's cool, it works, but really that's not as static as I would want. I don't want to have to run more code to get my final site. I'd love it to be as static as possible from the get-go. Okay, so that's awesome. So GitHub Pages is doing that. But why can't we go further? Why can't we make more data available that way? And if you're already running all this stuff for people anyway, then you eliminate the need of having to think about where does this data come from. what other kinds of data could we pull in? You know, you could pull in Twitter data. You could pull in Facebook data. You could pull in Instagram, Flickr, or like if you go running a lot or biking, Strava data to show your like where you've been running and biking. That would be cool. And there's like, you know, there's millions of services around that are gonna have data. Any data that you're putting online that you might want to pull into a personal site or a company site or anything. Why is that data not available at build time? Why do we have to wait and like pull in random third-party JavaScript libraries to do this after the page is already loading on the customer site? You know, doing that is going to be, limitation is going to be every time the external data changes, now your data is going to be stale. So, well, okay, but that's fine. Why don't we just have our site subscribe to those changes? We already know the site is going to build correctly, presumably because we're feeding in that data, we see it working. Maybe the site can subscribe to that change and say every time I tweet, rebuild my site. You know, make that a listenable event that then causes a regeneration of the static site. You know, and do that, right? So now that data is always available. It's always fully static. And you have to do zero work to get it, right? It's always just available in that site object if you want it, right? Maybe there's some config that's available that you just click boxes and say, give me Twitter, give me Strava, and give me my repo data, and now, bam, I do all the work. I don't have to worry about JavaScript at all. It's just static. I just read it out of that site structure. So that's another idea, right? All right, so another different idea that I've seen a little bit. I've seen it a little bit, but not much, really, is the idea of how do we get dynamic capabilities, dynamic functionality back into our static sites? Because if we have a blog, then we kind of lose commenting in a static way, right? You can include things like Discuss or other JavaScript commenting frameworks, but that kind of defeats the whole point of Jekyll, which is I don't want to lose my content anymore. And those comments, whatever user-generated stuff is coming back to me, I don't want to lose that. I don't want someone else to own that. That should be always in my repository. I should be able to I should be able to print that out. If I want to print out all my data, you know, and you know, for some reason, or see it on an airplane or whatever, like, it should be there. It should be in my repository, or it should be in Dropbox, or it should be wherever my files are. My comments should also be. And so why not do that? It's kind of really just another external data source that could be supplied to us, right? So GitHub Pages could do this, Cloud Cannon could do this, any host could do this and say, all right, you have a blog, you probably want comments, but you want those comments in your repository. So what we're going to do is give you a way to submit those comments to some URL, right? You know, it's got your ID or whatever in it, so it knows it's your blog and which post it goes to. And every time a comment is made, that could either make a commit to your GitHub repository if you gave it access, or save it to your Dropbox files, wherever that happens to be, how you store your files, write the data there. Right? This could be a service that would provide it. You'd have to hook it up, but you could do it, and then you'd have all your comments locally. And you know, you probably wouldn't store them as generated HTML. You'd probably store them as some JSON data files or something, right? But now you've got all of these. You could go in there if you want to remove a comment. Just go into your repository and, like, bam, delete it from that JSON data file. Done, right? Like, now the data's local. It's always going to be generated. And again, you're going to have to regenerate the site to do this. But, you know, our static site hosts are already doing this all day long. A site regeneration should become a trivial, common event, and it can update caching and make sure that, like, there's no problems there. But why can we not have commenting functionality as a first-class thing, like, everywhere, and not use external third-party services that we have to rely on to do that? I don't see any reason that we couldn't do that. And I'm sure there's other types of dynamic content that you can do that with, because storing data as flat files is something that we used to do a lot, you know, before we started using better databases. But for static site generation, a database as a static file is fine because you're not really performance restricted when you're generating a static site. Like, really, the generation can take as long as it wants, and users don't care. So if you have a bunch of JSON data files, and like the data directory that Jekyll has now is kind of the same thing. It's like, put the data in some data file, transform it somehow into the final output, and you're done. If a user interacts with it, then bam, write it to the site, regenerate, and now you've got your final site. Again, you're not going to be doing like massive amounts of user interaction this way, but really we're not trying to do that with our static sites anyway. Simple functionality, put it back in the repository, regenerate, and you're back. So is that a crazy idea? I don't know. I haven't seen people really do it very much. It's not something that I've seen offered. Maybe it's someone does it. I think that would be cool, but I think more people could offer it. Okay, I got a couple of minutes left, and there's one more thing, and this is, I don't know if this really counts, but I'm going to share my screen again. And so there's this thing called the leap motion. Oh, actually, I should show it to you. This is going to be hard. I don't know if I'm actually going to be able to show you simultaneously how this works. Okay. Oh, did I even share that? Was I sharing that? Was I sharing anything? Okay, I don't think so.
Yeah,
this is a leap. This is a leap motion device. Okay. The idea is that you put it like in front of your computer, and then you put your hands in front of it, and you can wave them, and you can like manipulate objects on your screen. It's basically reading your hand position and your finger position, and you can do it. You can do it with both hands, right, and manipulate objects. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, the reality, but the idea. That's the idea. That's cool. Okay, so I'm going to put this on my desk here. You're not going to be able to see it, but here's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be doing this. Woo, and then you're going to see something happen. So let me just share my screen. I'm going to share entire screen share. Okay. So here's this website, and this is just up on. This is a static file. This is the HTML file. It's just in a little thing, and it's on Cloud Cannon. Okay. So it's a static site. There's no trickery here. But check it out. I have this piece of hardware connected to my computer, and I've loaded a static page. Okay? And now I want you to, all right, hold on. I want you to behold, as I'm putting my hand on top of this leap motion device and moving it around, did you see what's happening here? Boom, left hand, right hand, right? Left hand out, right hand out. Now both hands again. I am interacting with this static web page. How am I doing that? Right? So the first time this happened, okay, I saw this and my mind literally exploded. It was messy, it was gross, but I couldn't understand it. Like this was some sort of black magic. My friend had one of these devices, and he I was like, how does it work? And he was like, oh, let me show you. He pulled up. This was actually a web page on Leap Motion's website, right? He went to leapmotion.com/something. I couldn't find it. They must have removed it since then. I went to this website, and he started doing this, and it was like making things change on someone else's website, and I couldn't handle it. I was like, how? I don't understand. Nothing in the universe. I don't understand how that's. How is it reading? How does it know? I couldn't handle it. Anyway, but it's amazing, right? Like that idea that a static site could know stuff about your local machine, and you're like, oh, WebSockets. It's using WebSockets. When you install this, and the drivers for it installs a WebSocket server on your local machine that your static web page is talking to, right? So when we usually think of WebSockets, we think about it as a web page connecting out to some server that's like a chat server or something, right? Generally, you think about it going out towards the cloud. But in this case, it's reading back towards your local machine. And I think that's really, really interesting, that idea that you can have a static website that's using JavaScript to talk over WebSockets to a local piece of machinery. All right, maybe nobody else cares. I can't hear anyone. How do I know if people care or not? I don't know. I need a screen that has like people on it or something. I don't know. Anyway, so those are my crazy ideas. Think about them. If you're building a static hosting site, think about how you can make the user experience even smoother for Jekyll, how you can eliminate the differences between boundaries between the local machine and the remote machine, and what it could mean to write information back to repositories if that becomes common, so that all of our data we still own, the whole point of Jekyll in the first place, and what kind of things we could do once we realize that WebSockets work this direction and not only the other direction. All right, thank you.
My mind is blown, Tom.
Okay, good. I got one. I know I got one. All right.
Yeah, no, sorry. I think I'm gonna have to represent everybody else out in the audience at the moment. I was like, holy shit.
Okay, good.
How far do you think you can take this VR with websites? I mean, what does a VR website look like?
VR with websites? Well, that's so I'm really interested in VR as well. So I think you can take it anywhere that like the web can take you, right? So VR is just another medium. It's another delivery medium. Just like, the radio is a medium for delivering content. Television is a medium. The web is a medium. Like VR is another medium. So the things that it makes possible are really limitless, but they're going to be specific to VR. Now, as a delivery mechanism, the web is pretty great, right? It's great for delivering web content. And now I'm going to contradict myself by saying, actually, I don't know that the web is the right mechanism to distribute VR, because you're going to need, like, here's what you don't want. Here's what you don't want. Oh, cool, a VR thing. Whoop. Neat, cool. Oh, yeah, rad. Okay. All right, browse. Oh, another VR thing. All right, where did I put? There it is. Oh, let me plug it back in 6 ways, because that's, all right. Whoop. Cool. Like, so that experience of having to constantly take off, put on and remove a VR headset is extremely annoying. So the web is designed to be on a screen. There is no barrier like that. What you really need for VR is something that's going to allow you to remain in a headset for as long as you want a VR experience or a set of VR experiences. So if that's what you're in the mood for, then you sit there and you kind of want, really you don't want VR via the web, you want the web via VR, right? Would probably be the more natural direction to do it. But for lightweight stuff, for experimentation, for this phase of VR, which is all like what is going to make sense, what use cases are actually useful, what are the limits of how far we can push it before people get motion sick. Like, the web is great for that because it's immediately available. If someone has a headset and they can just slip it on and experience something without having to download a bunch of stuff, then that reduces friction. But I don't think the web is going to be the primary vehicle for VR consumption for very long.
No, that's an interesting comment. I mean, I guess it's a case of the technology and the timeline sort of, matching up.
Yeah, and like the leap motion isn't VR specific. Like, there's some really cool use cases in VR. Like, really, it's meant to be usable for kind of anything. Now, I find the accuracy of it to be not what I really need to use it for practical stuff. I was mostly using it as an example of WebSockets coming towards you instead of going away from you.
Just changing tack slightly. Going back to the data sources and the external, looking at those externally, I mean, could you implement external data sources using Jekyll plugins? Yeah, certainly, right? Like, if your local machine is pulling data from Twitter or Facebook or whatever and then making it available to your site that way, then certainly you could do it, right? Like, but you still have the undeniable problem with plugins is that if you want to use some external host, well, guess what? You're out of luck because you got to generate all your content locally and then push that. And like, yeah, that's not the worst thing in the world. But really, the beautiful idea for me is you have the Jekyll version of your site over here, and you push it somewhere, and it becomes and is transformed into the final version. Having to convert it locally and then push static HTML pages, to me, is just, I don't know. I mean, really, there's no reason that it should be that I should feel that way about it. But for me, like, I don't want to have to do that. I want to just author, push, like, done. I guess it's the multiple, like, having to do it in multiple places and not knowing what the difference is. It's the not knowing that always gets us into trouble. And then we have to create things like the GitHub Pages gem to be like, all right, here's all the versions that we're going to use on GitHub Pages so that we can be reasonably sure that you're going to use them. But also custom plugins, yeah, you're not going to get to do those. So then, like, what's even the point? Then you may as well just have a static site host and call it a day, or that just does static web pages. But I don't want to do that. I don't want that extra step of generating HTML and having to push that. I want the experience of writing a markdown file, pushing it, and being done with it. I don't want to do anything else. Like, I don't want to look at it locally. Like, don't even show it. I don't want to look at it locally. What do I want to look at it locally for? Just let me push it somewhere and see what it's going to look like. Cool. Um, I mean, before everything turns VR and we get into that part of the future, I mean, do you think there is still a time for a big migration back to static? I mean, the web was static, then it was dynamic, and now we're sort of in a middle ground. Maybe. Do you think there's a big resurgence heading back towards static?
It seems unlikely. More what I see is that more things now are static that should have always been static, right? So we didn't have the tools to do it, and we all were like, at some point, everyone was like, oh crap, we could do like dynamic things on the web and have user-generated content, and then okay, everyone did that, and all the tools were for that. But then you start hitting scale, right? The requirements for scale, and you say, okay, also, your content has to be viewable by 100 million people, every minute. You're like, oh, okay, all right, well that's a different set of requirements. So then people discovered caching, and we're like, okay, we can totally do that as long as we just cache everything and essentially create static files whenever they're necessary. Okay, so I mean, any website that you go to is going to be any large website, right? Like GitHub. If you go to GitHub, it's mostly static. Actually, you're not actually seeing much dynamic content. That's just coming straight out of cache, right? Any big site's going to be like that. It's not making something just for you. It's not delivering this content just for you. It's generating it once and then giving it to as many people as it can, often over a CDN. So I think the lines between dynamic and static are blurred, right? So, but when we talk about static, I think we're more talking about like static from the beginning, not dynamic and then turning static, right? But I don't know. I don't think that's necessary, right? Like there's going to be different right tools for different jobs, and over time we'll see where those boundaries lie. For simple sites, not having to worry about a dynamic element is probably the biggest thing, right? Like it makes you want to put that content out more, knowing that you're not going to have to constantly think about it being hacked because of some back-end software, some administrative software that's available. That to me is the biggest benefit of static. So, well, there's a couple, but one of the biggest ones is I can publish a blog, and I just don't even have to worry about it. I don't have to worry about losing my data by giving it to someone else. I don't have to worry about constantly maintaining it. And like, I mean, those are the two biggest things for me, right? So should more of the world be static? Will more of the world be static? It's already mostly static. Anything that gets a lot of traffic better be static, because in today's internet, you can't dynamically generate things for everyone every time. It's not doable, right? It's just where is the layer of static generation?
Great, and time for one last question. Again, Ben Gundy-Shepherd from the Twitter stream. His question is, what is the most understood thing about Jekyll? And I just want to add on to that as well. What do you think is the most misunderstood thing about Jekyll?
The most understood thing about Jekyll? What was the question?
Yeah, that is the question. I guess maybe you could change into what's the thing that's easiest to communicate about Jekyll and why you should use it. And then again,
yeah. Okay, I get it. Yeah. So I think it's about simplicity. It's about a nice marriage of simplicity and power, right? I think Jekyll strikes a very good balance between, hey, you make it really easy to get started. The addition of Jekyll New, I think, was huge for that, right? Jekyll never used to be able to, like, you used to have to like copy some example site and then go from there. Jekyll New was a huge usability addition to say, just run Jekyll New and you'll get some. It's the hello world of Jekyll, right? And so the website does a really good job of communicating that. It's like, you've probably heard of Jekyll through something, right? Because it's super popular now. And if you want to get started, you run this one command, and like you can go from there. Okay, so that's simple. But then you also know, and if you Google around, people are using Jekyll for all kinds of things in all kinds of different ways, and there's tons of examples. And so I think you can see that it's simple to get started, but you can also see that whatever you want to do with it, Jekyll probably has a plugin to do it, or you can extend it yourself. It has a reputation for being very powerful that way. So I think Jekyll does a great job of that, and that is what drives continued usage of it. As far as a misunderstood thing about Jekyll, I think it's maybe that Jekyll has always been designed to be kind of a power tool, and I hope that we don't sacrifice power for a bigger audience, right? There's going to be other tools that are better for lay people, right? That's always going to be the case. and it becomes dangerous to try to serve everyone all the time. I think it's totally fine to say Jekyll's not for everyone. There are other things like hosted WordPress or Medium that might be better if you're a layperson and you want to create a blog. They'll take care of a lot of this stuff for you. You'll have to be a little bit more concerned about who owns content, but Jekyll was designed to be, the blog post that I wrote to announce it was blogging like a hacker. Jekyll has always been designed to be a kind of a hacker tool for people that really want to modify and curate and know everything and have that flexibility around their blogs in a way that I don't know that everyone does. And so I would just say, as you are contributors, people are contributing, think about that. Think about that idea that Jekyll should be for a specific audience, and it doesn't have to be for everyone in order to be the best.
Cool. I think that's a great sentiment to finish that segment on. Thank you very much,
You're welcome.
Tom, for taking the time to speak to us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I think there's a few people on the Twitter stream that would really like to keep engaging with you, and I know that I've definitely got some questions that are kind of come up when I have time to think about what VR means on static.
Yep, I will spend a few minutes and follow up on Twitter.
Awesome. Thank you very much.